Good evening, this is the Oscar expert here with Brother Roan. It's time to review Black Panther Wakanda Forever, sequel to Black Panther.
That was really informative. No one knows that.
It's a movie that we think is very good and is one of the top Marvel movies out of the ones that I have seen, I would say.
Black Panther really brought a level of sophistication to the craft of Marvel. Marvel seems to have a love-hate relationship with their auteurs. Like, they want to put them behind the camera, but they don't really want them to, take over the movie, and they got to keep things moving in a certain way. And Black Panther was sort of an interesting mixed bag for me of Marvel junk and actual really impressive shit and high level crafts.
But it was mostly impressive shit.
And the story was good, but mainly though, the story of Black Panther was actually interesting. It was stimulating on, a social and political level.
And a stylistic one too.
Yes. Now this one, I would say that the crafts are still there. The performances are great. The performances are there. What's missing here for me is the story. I almost want to talk about positive things before I just start telling you why I don't like this. So maybe we should just start positive.
I like that this movie still continues some of the themes from the first film in how this universe is kind of like an escape or a fantasy away from colonialism, where this African nation actually has control over their resources and other countries won't touch them.
Well, the other countries want to touch them, but...
Yeah, but they're all too powerful. And once again, I think there is a strong villain here, like in Black Panther, where this villain's backstory, he's also motivated by the threat of colonialism and the grief that they've caused within him.
Yeah. The villain in this film, he can understand where Wakanda's coming from because the same place that he's coming from. This film also dives into how damaging colonialism has been for the indigenous. And I think there's a huge value in creating a world around something that doesn't exist, but celebrates very deeply an identity that preceded Western influence. Even though it is a fantasy world, it is very much derived from cultures in Africa that do exist. And so the world building around that's really fascinating and very meaningful, very deep. The main production element that I thought stood out was the costumes, because they really do look so original and intriguing that it feels like they were developed outside of any other framework. The way that the wardrobe defines the characters within their community and defines who they are as being just so separate from the world we live in. Costumes were stunning throughout. And yes, the villain does have a great backstory, and it's played by Tenoch Huerta, who is absolutely a really exciting rising talent. We see Denai Guerrera reprising her role from the first. She's as excellent as she was there. And I'm kind of wondering, why haven't I seen her in more stuff? Maybe she's in TV and I'm not aware of it. Lupita Nyong'o really shines in a supporting role. And Letitia Wright is great helming this film. And Angela Bassett delivers a ferocious performance, one that is, where she has to go quite deep into her grief. There are two parts of this movie that I think are, great. And that's, the first 10-15 minutes. And then there's Tenoch Huerta, the villain's backstory. I think all of that is set up beautifully. And I think the rest of it is kind of gunk.
I don't know if I would call it gunk. I would just call it meh or Marvel filling.
Mid.
Because
Marvel filling, that kind of is a synonym for gunk,
Yeah, I was super into the first 15 minutes of this film and I thought everything was working and I was on board, I was ready. And then I slowly kind of lost faith in this movie because I just got drawn into filler. Except for when we get stuff about Namor and his backstory. That is important.
Characters.
And it's a good character, and we're learning about him and his world. That's all fascinating.
And learning about his world was cool. I didn't say that, but seeing his world was also quite fun.
But basically, this is a 2-hour, 40-minute movie, and a lot of it just feels like plot to have plot. To me, it feels uninspired. Some people felt like the story was totally inspired and great the whole time. I watched a different movie, I guess I would say. I just didn't care about very much that was going on. It just became kind of a blur. Scenes would happen and then they wouldn't matter to me when they were over and they would just slowly fade from my mind. Whether it's an action scene that is more dull in presentation than what we saw in Black Panther 1, that was pretty disappointing, honestly. There were not as many interesting or ambitious visual or directing choices here.
There were some, but they weren't consistent throughout.
But when I think of, I still remember the long take in Black Panther 1 where they got the spears and then they're fighting in the 2-story place. That was a sick scene. There's the car chase scene in the first one, which was really cool. In this one, they do kind of try to recreate the car chase scene for some reason. They're let's bring them to America to have a car chase scene, but it'll just be weird. Not as good as the first one.
I mean, I would say there were some really stunning shots throughout the movie. They're sprinkled in there, and there's there's really beautiful use of slow motion oftentimes. But I think it was more of a sprinkle on top of like a sort of bland, vanilla cake.
This movie feels like a sequel, and I mean that in the not good way. I'm sure you've experienced this with some sequels where they just feel like the writers got into a room and they were like, what are things that we can get the characters to do that will take time up in the movie? And they don't feel like they're being motivated from a very deep place. Like, Letitia Wright, her internal conflict didn't seem to spark until the second half of the movie. Like, you can see something there, but it's dormant for a lot of the first half. And then it comes alive in the second half. And I did like the second half better because I did feel like her and her internal conflict were at the center of the movie. But a lot of the first half, a lot of it's setting up the conflict that will take place between Wakanda and, Namor's nation. I feel like you could have taken a lot of shortcuts to just kind of get to the chase. Like, there's a conflict between the two that we need to figure out. But instead, the movie's like, needs to introduce this new scientist college girl character. I honestly felt like that character was kind of wasted. She could have been a really fun side character. Letitia Wright's already a scientist, so it didn't even feel that different, like, personality-wise from the other characters in the film.
Yeah.
And she didn't seem to have anything going on like internally that could have made her an interesting character foil or someone to examine. It was just like, why this character? Just because you are a sequel and you want to introduce a new person, I guess.
I think what was weird is that they set her up to be like the stakes character, the one that the central character has their heart out for and is like sort of trying to preserve like their life, and then eventually like they will kind of give their life back in some sense to the protagonist. And so like they set it up this way, but it doesn't really pay off in that sense. Like, it was kind of weird by the end how little character development there was for this scientist. Like, I mean, I don't even know if there was any at all. And especially, with the stakes character dynamic, they could have given Letitia Wright a bond with her. It felt like what Letitia Wright needed, especially given her emotional conflict. She is without guidance and identity in the midst of this crisis. What she needed was to like connect with other human beings and then recreate that in some way, and that would have been like emotionally satisfying. And they don't even really do that, and that's kind of like an obvious thing that you could do. I feel like there's really weak character development with the side characters.
Yeah, all the side characters.
They sort of pay service to what Letitia Wright is going through in little moments, but really it feels very divorced from the central and physical conflict. And the Martin Freeman character felt like almost entirely unnecessary.
Well,
like,
I'm okay with him being unnecessary because he's just kind of like funny, and he's only,
You're
he
okay
pops
with
in
that?
it. Yeah, if it's a comic relief character and it's just like we just want to see him because he was in the first one. Like,
but like give him more of a purpose.
Well, I thought it was dumb because the Julia Louis-Dreyfus conflict that he has going on, it's like,
I meant nothing,
but it's my ex-wife. The little mini story of that, it didn't really play into much outside of that, and it was kind of a waste of Julia Louis-Dreyfus. I do think that in terms of like dealing with the death of Chadwick Boseman, like the movie does a really good job. I think that it was absolutely the right choice to make him die of a disease in the movie and have the characters deal with that. And all the actors are well up to the task of taking over this movie, as I felt that they would be, given that they gave great performances in the first one as well. I think that the way that they deal with that in the beginning and the end of the film is great. And they did make Letitia Wright and other characters in the film deal with grief throughout the movie. And they kind of did make that the central conflict, which I think was a smart choice too. But ultimately, the message on grief in this film ends up being just extremely obvious. Like, we must hold on to our loved ones and not let ourselves become angry because of that they died. And it's like, okay, like that's kind of obvious. I've heard that before. This wasn't really that profound to me. Like, for that to be the central conflict of this 2-hour, 45-minute movie, I mean, the rest of it was, action stuff that was fine. Like, the action was okay. For a Marvel movie, it was probably above average. Pretty well shot. Like, the production design, the costumes, that stuff's always there. The score is great. The scenes become a blur, and I just didn't feel like they were memorable enough. I felt that they were often very cutty in a way that I was disappointing, because Ryan Coogler is sometimes great at scenes that use cuts minimally.
This film's main problem is that the characters don't really feel like they're going anywhere. It feels like all of it is in service of a plot. We have to get this to save the nation, but we lose like what the characters are really going through throughout it. And yeah, there is something that the protagonist is going through. It's very clear, especially in like the last act and the second half. Like, yes, I know what it is, but it doesn't really have a relationship with the physical battle that's going on. And I also think, with antagonists being very interesting. Once we understand that past all the backstory, there's just a person who wants to gain like power and influence and kill a bunch of people, we kind of lose his story as well. And that last climactic scene doesn't actually feel that impactful to me because the persuasion that's going on isn't really there. It's just like who's winning, you know, who physically wins the battle, and then like what does that cause the person to do as like a very direct result of being physically defeated. That's not interesting. When you can convince somebody to change their mind, you know, even if it's in a battle scene where they're like smacking each other while they're doing it, at least that's better than what I saw here. Because we don't go back and forth between like Namor and the Wakandans. Like we just know the Wakandans are right. Whereas like in Black Panther 1, we don't know who's right. Killmonger actually might be right. And then in the end, he's like given a big credit for what he did. And like he developed the protagonist. That didn't happen in this film.
With the cinematography here, I think that it looks much better when things are bright and crisp and clear. Like in the first 15 minutes, I was really impressed with the visuals. Yep. But there's a lot of muddy, dark stuff here. There are a lot of nighttime scenes, a lot of underwater scenes. And you might be saying, actually, it's really dark underwater, and it's like, yeah, well, you know what? They invented a lot of lights. Underwater. They invented a lot of lights.
They had a sun underwater, by the way.
Yeah, and
you can do whatever you want. You can say that this world works in whatever way that you want it to. You can build a sun underwater. They did that in the movie, so it's not really an excuse for why it's so murky. The reason it's murky is because they have to world build, and Marvel probably doesn't give them a lot of time, maybe not enough resources, in order to do that in a very detailed way. They probably just like constrain it to a budget, and then like you sort of just get these like dark, muddy corners.
Yeah, I can't wait for The Little Mermaid.
Marvel is just like notorious at this point for just like rock forts and like just weird caves,
like gray backgrounds. But again, like when they allowed it to be bright, it looked good. Aside from some green screen problems,
from the costumes, for example, I felt that like vivid, you know, connection to who they were. But through the way that the city looked, which was very like undetailed, very gray, I didn't really get to experience that. And I think when you compare it to something like Avatar 2, the trailer played before this film, Avatar is so bright and so vivid and so like transfixing just with the images and the colors. And then this film was just kind of the opposite at times, which is weird because the trailer was visually stunning. I mean, there are some shots in this film that are great, but it just doesn't hold throughout because there's so much CGI.
Yeah, I didn't feel the sets as much as I did in the first Black Panther. And also just a refusal to actually build any sets at all because they have like the blue thing that they can shoot everything in. I also want to say that feeling emotional in the beginning or the end of the movie by showing images of Chadwick Boseman, like in a way, kind of an easy way to make the audience feel emotional. So it's like, I also question like how much credit I give the movie for that. Like they dealt with it perfectly. They get credit. Like,
like it was tasteful.
If you're gonna do that, like you're gonna get me.
I mean, listen, they made it like the emotional arc of the movie. That a character passed away who's also a real person. Like it's this weirdly intimate and personal connection. If I'm shedding a tear at this scene, it's partly because it's maybe a little well done, but it's mostly because there's a real connection that goes beyond this film that I'm just feeling. That sort of feels a little bit cheap. I'm not saying that they should have done it in a different way, but I'm saying that doesn't give you like a ton of credit. Me shedding a tear at this film is different from you like really earning it in something else.
Yeah, I wouldn't call it cheap at all. But I almost feel like it was like the perfect way to handle that.
But it's almost like it wants that to be like the best and most meaningful part of the movie. And that's a little strange to me.
I almost feel like this movie did enough things that were good that I could call it like passable. But I also just felt disappointed that the new Black Panther film to me felt like a lot of it was just a blur. I would give it a 5 out of 10.
I'll go ahead and like count the stars. Costumes, performances, score. Actually, you know, the score really helps too because when like visually it's just okay, but the score is like pounding and thumping and doing something interesting, like I'm immediately engaged. Like the score was really helpful.
Still one of the only Marvel movies that actually has like a real score.
Yeah, good backstory for the villain. I don't know if we give The Grief a star. I'm maybe like you where it's like It's probably a 5, but the story I feel like was just, they didn't really care. They just needed something for the characters to do. I don't like when movies make me feel like a zombie when I'm watching them, and that's what this film did for like 80% of it. I'm just gonna go with a 4.5.
Thank you for watching. Thank you for subscribing.
Which cool anti-imperialist society do you want to live in?